Twisted Alibi, Chapter 1. The Watchful Eye. The rain pelted the city streets, washing away the filth of another night while neon lights shimmered in the puddles. From his parked car across the street, Ethan Vale adjusted his rearview mirror, keeping his gaze locked on the entrance of the Monarch Hotel. The place reeked of discretion, high-profile guests, anonymous rendezvous, and enough secrets behind those gilded doors to fill a dozen case files. He checked his watch. 9:42 p.m. Right on time. Through the downpour she appeared, a silhouette framed beneath the golden awning. Isabel Holloway, dark-haired, elegantly dressed, the kind of woman who could shatter a man's resolve with a glance. She glanced over her shoulder, then slipped inside. Ethan sighed, reaching for his camera. The job was simple: capture proof of infidelity. That was what her husband, Richard Holloway, wanted. A picture worth a divorce settlement. Easy money. Except, it wasn't easy, because Ethan wasn't just watching Isabel, he was the man she was meeting. Chapter 2. Dangerous Games. 15. Minutes later, Ethan walked into the hotel lobby, shaking off the rain. The receptionist barely looked up as he made his way toward the elevator, pressing the button for the 11th floor. The hallway was silent, save for the soft hum of distant jazz music. Room 1124. He knocked once. The door opened slightly. The chain still hooked. Isabel's green eyes peered through the gap. "You were late," she whispered. "Had to keep up appearances." The chain slid free. He stepped inside, shutting the door behind him. The room smelled of jasmine and wine, a contrast to the storm raging outside. Isabel wrapped her arms around him, her body warm against his damp clothes. "We can't keep doing this," she murmured against his neck. Ethan smirked. "That's what you said last time." She pulled away, walking to the window, tracing her fingers along the glass. "Richard's getting suspicious. He hired—" She turned, hesitating. "He hired someone to follow me." Ethan arched a brow, feigning ignorance. "You're kidding," she shook her head. "He's convinced I'm cheating." He stepped closer, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Are you?" Her lips curved into a dangerous smile. "I suppose that depends on who's asking." Chapter 3. The Body. The phone call came 2 nights later. A dead man. A high-rise. Office. A bullet to the head. Ethan stood outside the Holloway Tower, gripping his coat against the wind as red and blue lights painted the skyscraper in eerie patterns. Richard Holloway was dead. Detective Frank Rourke stood by the building's entrance, his eyes narrowing as Ethan approached. "Vale," he greeted, the word laced with suspicion. "Didn't think I'd see you here." Ethan slid his hands into his pockets, keeping his voice level. "Had a meeting with Holloway scheduled for tomorrow. Wanted to see what happened." Rourke's gaze lingered. "Well, what happened is that someone put a bullet in his head. Execution style." Ethan exhaled slowly. His mind raced through a dozen scenarios, each one more damning than the last. He had no alibi, no clear way out, and worst of all, he already knew who the killer was. To be continued. Chapter 4. A Trail of Lies. The interrogation room smelled of stale coffee and sweat. Ethan sat across from Rourke, his expression carefully neutral. The detective leaned forward, tapping a folder against the metal table. "Something doesn't add up, Vale." Rourke flipped open the folder, revealing surveillance photos of Ethan entering Holloway Tower the night before. "Care to explain why you were there?" Ethan barely blinked. "I was supposed to meet Richard today, not last night. That's not me in those photos." Rourke smirked, sliding another photo across the table. This one showed a shadowy figure near the parking garage. "Funny, because this guy sure looks a lot like you." Ethan's jaw tightened. He knew better than to let his nerves show. "Planted evidence. If I wanted Holloway dead, I wouldn't be dumb enough to get caught on camera." Rourke leaned back, studying him. Maybe, or maybe you're just not as clever as you think. The detective stood, gathering the photos. We're keeping an eye on you, Vale. Don't go too far. As the door slammed behind him, Ethan exhaled, his mind racing. If they were already this close, he had to act fast. Chapter 5. The setup, Isabel's voice trembled through the phone. They're asking questions about us. Ethan gritted his teeth. Stay calm. They don't have anything solid. But they will. A plan formed in his mind, cold and calculated. If he wanted to get out of this, he needed a scapegoat. Someone else to take the fall. He needed to make sure the real killer was never found, and he knew exactly how to do it. Chapter 6. A perfect patsy. Ethan scrolled through his contacts, stopping at a name he hadn't used in years, Daniel Crow. A small-time criminal with a record long enough to make him an easy target. He dialed the number. It rang twice before a gruff voice answered. Who the hell is this? Ethan smirked. An old friend with a business proposition. I don't do favors. This one pays well. Silence. Meet me at the old pier in an hour, Ethan continued. We need to talk. An hour later, the fog rolled in thick over the docks. Crow stood near the edge, cigarette in hand. What's this about? Ethan handed him a manila envelope. Inside were stacks of cash and a dossier detailing Holloway's murder. I need someone to take the fall, Ethan said smoothly. And you're the perfect candidate. Crow scowled, flipping through the documents. This is serious shit. Serious money, Ethan corrected. Enough to disappear. Crow hesitated, then pocketed the cash. You better pray this works, Vale. Ethan watched as Crow walked off into the mist, a slow smile spreading across his lips. By the time the cops put it all together, Crow would be long gone, and Ethan Vale would be free. To be continued. Chapter 7. Shadows closing. In the next morning, Ethan sipped his coffee as he scanned the newspaper. Murder suspect identified. Police seek Daniel Crow. A clean setup. Too clean. Then his phone buzzed. Blocked number. He hesitated, then answered. A distorted voice whispered through the line. You think you're in the clear, Vale? A chill ran down his spine. Who is this? He demanded, a low chuckle. Then the line went dead. Someone knew, and they were coming for him. To be continued. Chapter 8. The unraveling Ethan paced his apartment, the weight of the anonymous call pressing against his chest. Someone knew. And if they knew, they could expose him. He had to find out who was pulling the strings before they pulled him under. His laptop hummed to life as he accessed the Holloway Tower security feeds. Feeds he wasn't supposed to have. He scrolled through the footage, stopping when he saw it. A figure tampering with the security cameras. The timestamp matched the night of the murder. But the figure wasn't Daniel Crow. It was Isabel. Ethan's blood ran cold. Had she set him up? Or was she playing her own dangerous game? A new text message flashed on his screen. Meet me at Pier 17. Midnight. Alone. Ethan stared at the message, his mind racing. Was it Isabel? Or the person who had called him? Earlier, either way, he was walking into a trap, and he had no choice but to spring it. Chapter 9. Pier 17. The pier was deserted save for the distant creak of rusted metal and the lapping of dark waters against the docks. A single street lamp flickered, casting eerie shadows across the wet pavement. Ethan stepped forward, his hand resting on the gun hidden beneath his coat. A figure emerged from the fog. Not Isabel, not Crow, Detective Frank Rourke. Ethan's breath hitched. What the hell are you doing here? Rourke smirked. Funny, I was about to ask you the same thing. Before Ethan could respond, Rourke tossed something at his feet. A burner phone. the same kind the anonymous call had come from. "You should have cleaned up better, Vale," Rourke said, stepping closer. "You think you're the only one who plays dirty?" Ethan's mind spun. He had been careful. Hadn't he? Rourke leaned in, voice low. "I know what you did. And now, you're gonna do something for me." The detective's smirk widened. "Or you're going down for murder." Ethan had thought he was in control. He had never been more wrong. To be continued. The web titan's Ethan leaned against the windowsill, watching the rain streak down the glass as though it could wash away the tangled mess they'd created. Isabel was unpredictable, like a storm, beautiful but dangerous, and no one knew where it would strike next. "You need to be careful," Ethan said, his voice low but steady. Isabel turned her back to the window, her fingers curling around a glass of wine. "I've always been careful, Ethan. You should know that." There was a hint of something darker in her tone, something that made Ethan pause. He had seen this side of her before, the part of her that thrived on control, on manipulation. She was a woman who played with fire and rarely got burned, but Ethan wasn't like the others. He wasn't just some pawn in her game. "Richard's not the only one watching you," he said, meeting her eyes. Isabel's gaze flickered for a moment, but her composure quickly returned. She took a slow sip of her wine, her lips curling into a tight smile. "You think I don't know that?" Ethan's stomach tightened. He hadn't meant to give anything away, but the confession was out. They both knew they were tangled in something far deeper than just an affair. They were playing a dangerous game and no one was safe. "So what now?" Ethan asked, his voice colder than before. "Now?" Isabel said, walking toward him, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor. "You tell me what you found." He frowned. "What do you mean?" Isabel stopped in front of him, her gaze piercing. "The man Richard hired. You've been keeping an eye on him too, haven't you?" Ethan's mind raced. How had she known? He looked at her, but her eyes held no trace of uncertainty. She was testing him, pushing him into the corner of a game that was growing ever more complicated. "You're playing both sides, aren't you?" Isabel continued, her voice low and dangerous. "You've been trailing me, but you've also been trailing Richard's investigator. How long have you known, Ethan?" The revelation struck him like a slap. She had been watching him. Of course she had. Isabel never missed a thing, and the fact that she knew about his double life meant the stakes had just been raised. "Long. Enough," he said, trying to remain composed, even as the implications of her words began to sink in. She smiled, but it wasn't the smile of a woman who had just won a small victory. It was the smile of someone who had already won the war, and was now deciding how to play with her prize. "Good," Isabel purred. "Then you'll understand why I need your help." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "Help?" Isabel moved closer, her breath warm against his ear. "You're not the only one being watched, Ethan. Richard's not the only one who has secrets to hide. There are others, people who want to make sure none of us get out of this alive." Ethan froze. His mind spun, racing to keep up with the web Isabel was weaving around him. Secrets, lies, deceit. This wasn't just a case of infidelity anymore. This was something far darker, something more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I want you to help me destroy everything," Isabel said, her eyes gleaming with a cold, calculating fire. "I want you to help me burn it all down before they burn us." Ethan had always prided himself on being the one who called the shots, but in this game, Isabel was the one holding all the cards. The question now was whether he would fold or go all in. Chapter 4. Tangled lies. The night stretched on, but the storm outside showed no sign of letting up. Ethan stood at the edge of the bed, his thoughts churning. Isabel's proposition lingered in the air like a venomous cloud, heavy with the promise of betrayal. "I can't do this," he said, the words falling from his lips before he could. "Stop them!" Isabel raised an eyebrow, her lips curling into that familiar, dangerous smile. "You think you have a choice?" Ethan met her gaze, trying to see through the layers of manipulation, but all he could see was the woman who had always been in control, the woman who knew exactly how to get what she wanted. "You can't stop this," Isabel continued, her voice growing more insistent. "They'll find out everything, Ethan. About you. About me. About all of it. Unless what? Unless we work together." Isabel's gaze softened, though there was still an edge to it. "We can take down Richard. We can take down the investigator. We can take down anyone who gets in our way." Ethan's pulse quickened. He knew what she was asking. It wasn't just about lies anymore. It was about erasing everything. And in doing so, erasing themselves. He had never been one to play the victim. But as he looked at Isabel, standing there with that unsettling calm, he felt a sense of dread creeping over him. This wasn't about a simple affair. This wasn't about money or power or revenge. This was about survival. And in a game like this, the rules were clear. Chapter 5. The First Move. The days blurred into a haze, a twisted mix of late-night meetings, cryptic phone calls, and the constant tension that gnawed at Ethan's gut. He'd thought he could control the situation, but the deeper he went into Isabel's world, the less he understood. She was a master of manipulation, always 2 steps ahead, weaving a web of lies and half-truths so intricate that even he couldn't tell where the threads began or ended. Ethan stood in front of his apartment window, looking out at the city below. The neon lights flickered in the rain, a stark reminder that even the brightest lights could be swallowed by the darkness. He glanced at his watch. 10 p.m. Isabel had insisted they meet tonight, in a place that felt increasingly like a trap. He grabbed his jacket, then checked the small pistol he kept tucked in the inside pocket. It was a precaution, one he hoped he wouldn't need. But the more he got involved with Isabel, the more dangerous the game became. The ride to the rendezvous point was short, but every minute felt like an eternity. When he arrived, the old, decrepit warehouse loomed before him, a perfect place for secrets to die. Ethan stepped out of the car and made his way to the entrance, the rain now a mere drizzle. The rusty door creaked as he pushed it open, and the smell of mildew hit him almost immediately. Inside, the air was thick with tension. Isabel stood in the center of the room, bathed in the harsh light from a single overhead bulb. She was dressed, in black, her silhouette sharp and commanding. "Ethan," she said softly, her voice both a command and a welcome. "I'm glad you came." "I wasn't sure I had a choice," he replied, his gaze scanning the room. It was empty, save for a few crates and discarded machinery. It felt like a place for deals made in shadows and broken promises. "Good," Isabel said, stepping toward him. She reached out and placed a hand on his chest, her fingers cold against his skin. "Because you don't." Ethan's heart raced. This was it. The moment when everything would come to light. The moment when he would have to choose between playing the game or losing everything. Isabel wasn't just playing with fire anymore. She was the fire. She stepped back, her eyes never leaving his. "I have a plan. We take down Richard, the investigator, anyone who stands in our way, but we do it carefully. We're not just burning bridges, Ethan. We're demolishing everything in our path." "How?" Ethan asked, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. Isabel smiled, a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "We start with the investigator. Richard's hired muscle is too close to the truth. He's getting suspicious of you. But he doesn't know about me." "Not yet." Ethan frowned. "You want me to kill him?" "No," Isabel replied, her smile widening. I want you to make him think you're on his side. Get close to him. Let him trust you. And when the time is right, we turn the tables." Ethan felt a surge of unease, but he kept his voice steady. "And then, Isabel said, her voice dropping to a whisper, "we use him to get to Richard. We bring them both down, together." Ethan took a deep breath. It was madness. It was dangerous. And yet something inside him told him that if he didn't play along, he would never leave this game alive. "I'm in," he said, the words feeling heavier than they should have. Isabel's eyes flickered with approval. Good. Now, we wait. Chapter 6. The Investigator. The next few days were a blur of tension and silence. Ethan kept his distance from Richard, making sure not to arouse suspicion. But his every move was being monitored by the investigator, who, unbeknownst to Richard, had started to take a keen interest in him. Ethan had done his homework on the man, Vincent Holt. A former cop turned private investigator, Holt was known for his unflinching ability to uncover secrets and destroy the people hiding them. Ethan played his part well, appearing in the places Holt expected him to be, striking up casual conversations, and giving just enough to make Holt believe he was nothing more than an eager informant. He was careful, cautious, always aware of the hunter's gaze on him, but Holt was smart, too smart. One evening, as Ethan left a bar he'd frequented for years, he spotted Holt standing in the shadows, watching him. Ethan's pulse quickened. It was time to see if Holt would bite. "Evening, Mr. Vale." Holt's voice cut through the air, low and measured. Ethan turned, feigning surprise. "Holt, right? What are you doing here?" Holt stepped forward, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I could ask you the same thing, but I already know why you're here." Ethan's hand subtly brushed the grip of his pistol beneath his jacket. This wasn't supposed to happen. He wasn't supposed to be caught. But then again, that was the game they were playing. "You've been keeping an eye on me," Ethan said, forcing a smile. "I assume it's professional curiosity." Chapter 8. The final move, Ethan opened the door, his hand still lingering near the doorknob, the sense of inevitability hanging thick in the air. Isabel stood in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the dim hallway light. Her eyes, sharp and calculating, scanned him with that knowing look, as though she could see through every layer of his facade. "You're late," Ethan said, his voice betraying none of the tension coursing through him. Isabel smirked, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "Time's relative, Ethan. We're past the point of punctuality now." She closed the door behind her, locking it with a soft click that felt more like a sentence than a precaution. Her heels clicked against the hardwood floor as she approached him, each step deliberate, her every move a reminder of the power she wielded over him. "Things are getting messy," she said, her gaze piercing. "Vincent Holt is close. Richard's getting more paranoid by the day. I think it's time we escalate." Ethan clenched his jaw. This wasn't just about infidelity anymore. It was about destruction, about dismantling everything they had built with lies and manipulation. He had seen this before, the moment when the game shifted from dangerous to deadly. "Escalate how?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady despite the rising panic in his chest. Isabel walked over to the window, her fingers tracing the rain-slick glass as she looked out into the night. "We make our move. We make them both think we're done with them. Holt will let his guard down and Richard will think he's winning. Then we strike. We feed them what they want to hear, and in doing so, we make sure they never see us coming." Ethan felt his stomach churn. He had known from the beginning that Isabel was a master at playing people, but this was different. This was cold, calculated, and lethal. "You're asking me to betray them both," he said quietly, "to play both sides until there's nothing left." Isabel turned, her lips curling into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You don't have a choice, and neither do I." The words stung more than he expected. Ethan had always thought he could walk away from any situation, control his fate. But Isabel had pushed him into a corner, and now the walls were closing in. He exhaled slowly, the weight of her words pressing down on him like a vice. "What happens after we make our move?" Her smile widened, but it held no warmth. "After? After we take what's ours. We walk away clean with everything we need: money, power, freedom." She paused, her eyes darkening. "And if anyone stands in our way, we destroy them." Ethan's pulse quickened. Isabel was a force of nature, and he was caught in her current. But as much as he wanted to walk away, wanted to escape this twisted game, he knew it was too late. He had already crossed the point of no return. "I'm in," he said, the words feeling like a death sentence as soon as they left his lips. Isabel's eyes gleamed with approval, but there was no joy in her expression. This wasn't about victory for her, it was about survival, and that made her dangerous in a way Ethan hadn't fully understood until now. "We do this tonight," Isabel said, her voice low and filled with finality. "It's now or never." Chapter 9. The Fall Hours. Later, Ethan stood outside Richard Holloway's penthouse, the weight of what was about to happen sinking in. He had no illusions left. Tonight was the night everything would change, one way or another. Isabel had been clear. They had to make Richard think he was winning, that he was about to have the power to destroy her. She had already planted the seed, feeding him just enough to get him to trust her once more. All they needed was one more push, one more lie to set the pieces in motion. Ethan glanced at the phone in his hand. It was time. The plan was simple. He would send a message to Holt, pretending to come clean, pretending to be on his side. Then he would wait for Richard to take the bait. He hit send, watching the words form on the screen. "I have everything. The investigator's name is Vincent Holt. Meet me in 30 minutes. I'll tell you everything you need to know. We can end this." Ethan slipped the phone into his pocket and turned toward the elevator. His fingers were trembling as he pressed the button to the penthouse floor, a mixture of fear and adrenaline flooding his senses. The doors opened with a soft chime, and he stepped inside, his mind racing with the realization of what he was about to do. Isabel had prepared him for this moment, every move, every lie, every deception. But no amount of preparation could have prepared him for the coldness he felt when Richard greeted him at the door. The man's face was hard, angry, an expression that made Ethan feel like he was stepping into a lion's den. "Come in," Richard growled, stepping aside to let him enter. Ethan stepped inside, his heart pounding in his chest. Chapter 10. The Point of No Return. The gun in Isabel's hand glinted under the harsh light of the penthouse. The moment she stepped into the room, the air seemed to freeze, the world outside falling away. Ethan's heart hammered in his chest as he took in the scene. Richard's expression went from shock to fury in an instant, and for a moment he seemed paralyzed, caught between disbelief and rage. "You," Richard began, his voice thick with disbelief. "You're working with him? After everything?" Isabel didn't even flinch. Her gaze never left Richard, her eyes as cold and unyielding as the gun she held with perfect ease. "I'm not working with anyone, Richard. I'm working for myself," she said, her voice steady, almost detached. "And you've become an obstacle." Ethan's thoughts scrambled. He had known Isabel was dangerous, but this was something different. She wasn't just playing both sides. She was playing every side, controlling every move, and making sure no one, not even Ethan, knew what the next move would be. Richard's hand shot toward his desk, towards a drawer Ethan knew held a weapon, but Isabel was quicker. The sharp crack of gunfire echoed through the room before Richard could even react. The bullet struck the wood of the desk with a sickening thud, splintering the surface, and Richard froze, his face contorted with pain and disbelief. "Not so fast," Isabel said, her tone now as sharp as the glint in her eyes. Ethan's chest tightened, his breath caught in his throat. He had been playing along, thinking he was still in control, still part of a plan. But this was a turning point. Isabel wasn't making a move in their twisted game anymore. She was making the final play. And Ethan wasn't sure whether he was still part of the team or the next victim. Richard, now pale and shaking, hesitated. "You bitch! What do you think you're doing?" Isabel's eyes flicked toward Ethan for a brief moment, and he caught something in her gaze. Something like approval. Like this was part of the script he had agreed to play. "You think this is about you, Richard?" Isabel said, turning back to him with a sadistic smirk. "No, this is about survival, about power, and it's about time you learned that you're just a pawn." Ethan's head swirled with confusion and dread, but something inside him snapped. He wasn't a pawn. He was a player. He had to be. If he let Isabel dictate everything from here on out, if he allowed her to drag him deeper into this twisted game, he would have no way out. He needed to make a move. Slowly, Ethan stepped back, inching toward the door, his eyes never leaving the gun in Isabel's hand. The last thing he needed was to be caught in the crossfire between the two of them. Isabel was a force, no doubt about that, but Richard still had influence. He could turn this around if he had the chance. As Ethan reached for the door, Isabel's sharp eyes caught him in the act. "You're leaving?" she asked. The faintest hint of surprise in her voice, but it was quickly masked by cold indifference. "I'm not part of your mess," Ethan said, his voice steady but strained. "You've got this figured out. But I'm done." For the first time since the moment Isabel entered the room, a flicker of uncertainty passed across her face. She didn't drop the gun, but her grip seemed to loosen just a fraction. "Done?" she repeated, her voice laced with disbelief. "You don't get to be done, Ethan. You're in this whether you want to be or not." Ethan's eyes darted between her and Richard. He needed to make this count. "I never wanted to be in this," he snapped, his voice rising. "But you've pushed me too far. You've used me, lied to me, and now you're about to kill us both for what? Power? Because you think you can. Get away with it all?" Isabel's eyes narrowed, the faint flicker of uncertainty disappearing into a storm of cold resolve. "Don't make this harder than it has to be. I didn't drag you into this game. You chose to play. Now, you can either be useful or become collateral." Ethan's gaze hardened. Collateral. It was the final word, the one that would define his future. He had to decide. He could either continue to play this dangerous game, risking his life with every step, or he could try to break free once and for all. "You really think you can control all of this?" Ethan's voice was low, dangerous now, the words sharpening, like a knife. "You're not the only one who can make plans, Isabel." For a split second, Isabel's expression faltered, just enough for Ethan to see the cracks in her carefully constructed mask. But it was enough. Without warning, Ethan lunged forward. He grabbed the gun out of her hand, twisting her wrist and using his body weight to send her stumbling back. Isabel let out a sharp cry, but Ethan didn't stop. He kicked the gun out of her reach, sending it skittering across the floor. Richard, still reeling from the gunshot wound to his arm, seemed too stunned to react. Chapter 11. The Reckoning. The silence in the room was deafening. Ethan stood with the gun in his hand, its weight heavy but not from the metal. It was the weight of his decisions, the heavy toll of the life he had chosen, the choices he had made leading him to this very moment. Isabel stood across from him, her face still unreadable, her eyes calculating every shift in his stance, every muscle in his body. "You think you're going to walk away from this?" Isabel said, her voice low and dangerously calm. "Do you honestly believe you can just walk out the door and leave me behind, after everything we've done together?" Ethan didn't respond, keeping his gaze fixed on her. There was a flicker of something, maybe a hint of fear, or perhaps respect. But whatever it was fleeting. Isabel Holloway wasn't a woman who was used to being threatened, let alone confronted, and right now she was calculating her next move, just like Ethan was. "You don't get to make the rules anymore," Ethan said, his voice steady, his grip on the gun unwavering. "You had your chance. You had your game. But now it's over." For a moment, she said nothing. Instead, she stepped closer, slowly, with a grace that was almost unsettling. Richard, his arm still dripping blood, shifted uneasily, watching them both. "Like a man caught between two predators. You think I'm the problem here?" Isabel asked, her voice sharp with a hint of mockery. "You really think I'm the villain in this little drama? You're not the hero, Ethan. You're just a man who got in way too deep, too late to save himself." Ethan's jaw clenched, his mind racing. She was right. He had always been on the sidelines, waiting, watching, letting her pull the strings. But now he had a gun in his hand. And for the first time, he realized that the power to end it was his. He could stop this. Stop the game. Stop her. Stop everything. "You were never supposed to be the hero," Isabel continued, a dark smile curling on her lips. "You were just supposed to be the perfect alibi. But look where we are now." Her gaze flicked to Richard, still bleeding, still unable to comprehend what was unfolding. "He was always the one who was supposed to be the casualty, not you." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. Everything about her words cut deep. She wasn't just talking about the past. She was laying out her vision of the future. One where she was always in control, one where everyone else fell into line, and that future was one Ethan couldn't live with. "You really think you've won, don't you?" Ethan said, his voice low, dangerous. "You've spent so long thinking you could manipulate everyone, but now you've got to answer for your choices." Isabel's eyes narrowed, her expression darkening. "Answer for my choices?" She laughed, the sound chilling. "You don't get to make demands. Not anymore." Before Ethan could react, she moved in a blur of motion, her hand reaching toward her waistband where a small blade was tucked. Her speed was unnerving, and for a moment, Ethan's instincts screamed at him to pull the trigger, but something held him back. She was too close. In the fraction of a second it took for her to pull the knife, Richard lunged, an angry roar escaping. Him as he threw his remaining weight into a desperate tackle, trying to catch Isabel off guard. Isabel staggered, but she didn't lose her grip on the blade. Ethan's mind raced, but he didn't hesitate. He raised the gun, and with a steady hand, fired. The shot echoed through the room, deafening. Isabel froze mid-movement, the blade in her hand clattering to the floor. Blood stained the front of her clothes, her expression one of shock, then rage. She staggered back, her hand clutching at the wound in her side, but she didn't fall. Instead, she looked up at Ethan, her eyes burning with fury. "You think you've won?" she spat, her voice hoarse. "You've just signed your death warrant. You'll never escape this. Not you, not Richard. You think you're out? No one walks away from me. Not like this." Ethan felt a pang of guilt, but it was quickly drowned by the overwhelming need to end this. End the cycle of manipulation, lies, and deceit that had dragged him into the darkness. He stepped forward, lowering the gun slightly, his eyes never leaving hers. "I'm not the one who's been playing games, Isabel," Ethan said, his voice low but resolute. "And I'm not your pawn anymore." Her eyes flashed with a violent mix of disbelief and hatred. But she was weakening, the blood loss slowing her movements. Richard, still clutching his wound, looked between the two of them, torn between survival and revenge. "This doesn't end here," Isabel whispered, her voice barely audible. "You've just made the worst mistake of your life, Ethan Vale." And then, with a final defiant glare, she collapsed to the floor. Ethan didn't move, didn't speak, his mind still reeling with the force of what had just happened. Chapter 12. Into the Abyss. The rain hit Ethan's face like 1,000 cold needles as he stepped out into the night, the weight of his actions pressing down on him with every step. The distant hum of city traffic seemed distant, muffled by the pounding storm. But the knot in his chest tightened as he walked aimlessly down the slick, deserted streets. The cold did nothing to numb the haunting realization that Isabel, dead, betrayed, her web of manipulation undone, wasn't the only casualty in this game. He had made it out alive, but he wasn't free. Not yet. The glow of neon signs flickered above him, offering empty promises of solace, warmth, and escape. None of it meant anything. The city, his life, his choices, it all felt like a blur now, like a dream he was struggling to wake from. Isabel had been a master manipulator, but in the end, it was his own hand that had silenced her. He couldn't afford to pretend he was the same man anymore. A soft beep from his phone interrupted his thoughts, pulling him back into the present. He fished it out of his pocket, his eyes scanning the message from an unfamiliar number. "You didn't think it was over, did you?" Ethan stopped mid-stride, the world around him spinning for a moment. The message wasn't from Isabel. She was dead. But the words, they carried a weight, a sense of familiarity. He knew who it was, the one person who had been lurking in the shadows from the very beginning. Richard. Ethan's pulse quickened. He stared at the message, his thoughts whirling. Richard had been a pawn in all of this, an unwitting player perhaps, but now it seemed he was a survivor. And if he had managed to reach out to Ethan, that meant one thing. He was in this deeper than ever before. The message continued. "You think you've won. That Isabel was the mastermind. You couldn't be more wrong. It was never about her. It was about us." Ethan's fingers tightened around the phone. The words were like a knife twisting in his gut. What was Richard saying? Isabel's death wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something far darker, something that Ethan wasn't prepared for. "Meet me at the old pier. Midnight. Come. Alone. You'll understand." The phone clicked off before Ethan could respond. His eyes locked on the glowing screen. He had no choice but to go. The game was far from over. Isabel's death had only served to open a door to a new world, one that he wasn't prepared to enter, but had no choice but to walk through. The pier loomed ahead as Ethan made his way through the rain-soaked streets, the heavy scent of salt water mingling with the wet concrete. The wind howled, tugging at his jacket, and the dim, flickering lights from the old buildings gave the area a haunting, desolate feel. This was the kind of place where people disappeared, where deals were made in the dark and forgotten by the light of day. And tonight, he was going to become a part of that forgotten history. He reached the edge of the pier, his eyes scanning the shadows. The city was silent here, too silent. No cars, no people, just the creak of wood and the crash of waves against the pylons. "Ethan." Richard's voice came from the darkness, low and urgent. Ethan didn't flinch, but his mind raced. He'd been expecting this moment, but nothing could have prepared him for the cold, dead certainty in Richard's voice. The man was no longer just a victim. He was the architect of something far more complex. Ethan stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he tried to make out Richard's figure, shrouded by the rain and shadows. "You're here," Richard said, his voice coming closer now, steady but tinged with something dangerous. Anger? Fear? Perhaps both. "I was hoping you'd be smart enough to figure it out, but I wasn't sure." Richard emerged from the shadows, his suit drenched but still impeccably tailored, his face pale but sharp. His eyes were cold, hard. Ethan couldn't tell if the man was angry or if he had simply become someone else entirely. "Why am I here, Richard?" Ethan's voice was clipped, controlled. He wasn't afraid, at least not yet. But the tension was thick. He could feel it building, something ominous pressing on the edges of the moment. "What's this really about?" Richard looked at him for a long moment, as if deciding how much to reveal. Then, slowly, he stepped closer, his hands in his pockets, his face betraying no emotion. "Isabel wasn't the mastermind," Richard said, his voice quiet but fierce. "She wasn't the one pulling the strings. We were. And now you've made a very big mistake." Ethan's stomach twisted. "We?" "Yes," Richard confirmed, a bitter smile creeping across his face. "I knew about Isabel. I knew what she was doing, who she was working for. But I didn't know you were playing both sides. I didn't realize how deep you were in this, but now I do." The realization hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just Isabel's game. Beneath the surface, the wind howled as the waves crashed against the rotting pilings of the pier. Ethan stood motionless, his body soaked, his mind racing. Richard's words, "You have no idea what you're walking into, Ethan," echoed in his head, each repetition hammering into him like a warning. What had Richard meant by that? What game had Ethan been drawn into, and how deep did the rabbit hole go? His eyes swept over the darkened stretch of the pier, but there was nothing. The place was deserted, as if it were just him and the storm. But Ethan knew better. He could feel it now, that sense of being watched. A shiver ran down his spine. Richard hadn't been alone. No, he had just walked into something much larger, something far darker than he'd ever imagined. He didn't need to waste time wondering whether to go after Richard. That was already a lost cause. Whatever game Richard was playing, Ethan knew that stepping into that world would only get him tangled in more lies, more betrayals, and more danger. There was no room for hesitation anymore. If he was going to survive, he had to get ahead of this. And right now, survival meant finding answers. He needed to know exactly what Richard was talking about, and to do that, he needed to dig deeper, much deeper. The following morning, Ethan sat in his car, the engine running, the low hum of the idle engine the only sound in the otherwise empty parking lot. The gray skies hung heavy overhead, a blanket of clouds threatening more rain, but for now it was quiet. It was the silence before the storm. He pulled his phone from his pocket and dialed the one number he knew could give him some insight into the world Richard had hinted at. The only person who had been there before Isabel, before Richard, before everything. The line rang twice before a familiar, gruff voice answered. "Ethan." "You're still alive," the voice rasped, a hint of amusement mixed with something darker. "I need your help, Marco," Ethan replied, his tone serious. "Something's going on. I don't know what, but I can feel it. And I'm not going to make it out of this unless I get answers." There was a long pause, and then Marco's voice came back, harder, colder. "I thought we were done with this. You walked away, left it all behind. You were supposed to stay out of it." "I know. I thought I had too. But this thing, it's bigger than I realized. You were the one who warned me about the people behind Isabel, about what they were capable of. I need to know more, all of it." Marco sighed, and there was a rustling sound on the other end. A door opening, perhaps. A chair creaking. Then, his voice, quieter now, as if making sure no one else could hear. "This isn't just about Isabel. It's about the Holloway Syndicate." The name sent a chill through Ethan's spine. The Holloway Syndicate. A shadowy, almost mythical organization that had existed in whispers for years. Its name never spoken in public, but always feared. A network of corruption, dirty money, and power stretching across the city and far beyond. Isabel had been a part of it, sure, but it was Richard who had been its most secretive member. "Richard's involved in this?" Ethan asked, his voice tight with disbelief. "Not just involved," Marco replied, his voice dark with knowledge. "Richard Holloway didn't just marry Isabel. He inherited a seat at the table. He's been working with them for years, manipulating both sides, playing the game to his advantage. He's the one who's been orchestrating everything from the shadows. Isabel was just a pawn, a tool. You were a distraction." Ethan's stomach twisted. So this whole thing, the affair, the lies, the manipulation, it was all part of his plan. Exactly. And it's not over. Richard wants you, Ethan. He wants you in this game. And I don't think you're going to walk away from it like, you think? Why not? Marco's voice dropped to a low, conspiratorial whisper. Because you've already crossed a line. You're deeper in than you realize, and there's no going back now. Ethan gripped the steering wheel tightly, his thoughts racing. He had played the game. He had thought he could outsmart everyone, keep himself detached, be the observer. But now he was in it. And he was tangled in a web he didn't fully understand, pulled deeper by every move he made. I need to know more, Ethan said. About Richard, about the Holloway Syndicate, everything. There was a long pause on the other end, and Ethan could hear Marco's hesitant breath. All right, Marco said finally, the decision hanging in the air like a thick fog. Meet me at the old warehouse, the one by the docks. Midnight. Ethan knew exactly which one Marco meant. It was a relic of the city's industrial past, the kind of place that looked abandoned, but was still very much alive with secrets. It was the perfect place for them to meet in private. If Marco was willing to talk, then it was going to cost Ethan everything. But he didn't have a choice. I'll be there, Ethan said, his voice steady. Chapter 14. The Devil's Bargain. The warehouse's shadows seemed to grow longer as Marco's words lingered in the air like smoke. Ethan felt them tightening around him, a web he couldn't escape, no matter how hard he fought. He had always thought he was playing the game, controlling the pieces, using his instincts to survive. But now, faced with the truth about the Holloway Syndicate, Ethan knew he was only one of many pieces. Insignificant. Expendable. Look, Marco said, his voice steady, but there was a flicker of something darker in his eyes. You want to end this. Fine. But you have no idea what you're up against. Richard's not just a man with power. He's a symbol. They'll never let you walk away. Ethan clenched his jaw, the weight of Marco's warning sinking in. The entire syndicate had been pulling strings from the start. Isabel, Richard, everyone had been part of it. Even his own life, the case he had been hired to investigate, had been manipulated from the shadows. I didn't ask for any of this, Ethan growled, running a hand through his damp hair. But I'm already in it, Marco. You think I'm just going to walk away now? After what's happened? Marco stepped closer, his boots scraping against the concrete floor. I'm telling you this because I don't want to see you end up like me, Ethan, like everyone who tries to defy them. You fight them, you'll lose, and the cost will be far worse than you can imagine. Ethan's eyes locked onto Marco's, and for a moment, he saw the truth in the older man's weary gaze. Marco wasn't trying to save him. He was trying to save himself. Ethan had always known Marco walked a thin line between survival and collapse. But he wasn't going to let fear dictate his next move. He was in this now, no longer just a pawn, but a player. And the syndicate needed to be stopped. I don't care about the cost, Ethan said, his voice hardening with resolve. I'll take whatever's coming. I'm not letting Richard get away with this. Not after everything. Marco's face twitched, the corner of his mouth curling into a sad smile. Fine. If you're determined to go down this path, I'll help you. But you need to understand something. The syndicate isn't just a criminal organization. It's a kingdom. And Richard isn't the king, he's just the face. The real power is behind him. Ethan's pulse quickened. Who's behind him? Marco hesitated for a long moment before answering. You don't want to know. But Ethan was done with half-truths. He had played the game for too long to remain in the dark now. He leaned in, his voice low but insistent. Tell me, who behind? Richard. Marco met his gaze for the first time in a long while, and Ethan could see the fear in his eyes. Fear of what he was about to say. Finally, Marco exhaled, the sound almost defeated. The board. The word hung between them like an unspoken curse. It wasn't just a name. It was an institution. The board was the core of the syndicate, a group of shadowy, untouchable figures who wielded unimaginable power, wealth, and influence. They were the ones who truly controlled the city, its politics, its money, its crime. Richard was just a figurehead, a puppet. The board were the ones pulling the strings. Ethan's stomach twisted as the pieces fell into place. He'd been used. His entire life, everything he'd worked for had been manipulated. But now, with Marco's revelation, he saw the bigger picture. The game he had been playing wasn't just about Isabel, or Richard, or even his own survival. It was about power, the kind of power that didn't just move people, but entire empires. The board? Ethan repeated, his voice tight. How do I even get close to them? Marco shook his head slowly. You don't. No one gets close to them. Not unless they want you to. They don't play by the same rules, Ethan. They're beyond everything. You know. Ethan felt his anger rise. So what? I'm supposed to just accept that they win? They get away with everything? Marco's eyes darkened, and he stepped back, his hand rubbing his jaw as if weighing his next words carefully. There's a way to get close, but it's not clean. You'll have to make a deal, and the price is high. Ethan narrowed his eyes. What kind of deal? Marco paused for a long moment, his gaze flickering to the shadows that seemed to press in around them. The warehouse felt colder now, as though the walls were closing in. There's someone inside the syndicate, a rogue player. They've been feeding information to people who are trying to take the board down from the inside. Marco's voice lowered, his words dripping with caution. If you can find them, they might help you. But you need to be careful. This person is playing their own game, and they're not to be trusted. Who is it? Ethan asked, his pulse racing. Marco hesitated. I can't tell you, but if you dig deep enough, you'll find them. Just be ready. This person won't give you anything without something in return. And trust me, whatever they ask for, you won't like it. Chapter 15. The Devil's Bargain. The cold, damp night air hit Ethan's face as he stepped out of the warehouse, his breath visible in the chill. The city loomed around him, dark and indifferent, as if it had witnessed so many men like him, driven by desperation, by rage, by the need for revenge, only to chew them up and spit them out. But Ethan wasn't like the others. He wouldn't be broken. He couldn't afford to be. He had to find them. The rogue player inside the syndicate, the one who could bring down the board. Marco's warning still echoed in his head, but Ethan didn't have the luxury of hesitation. He needed answers, and he needed them now. Whatever it cost. He pulled his collar up against the wind and made his way through the maze of narrow streets and alleys, his mind already spinning through the possibilities. Who could he trust? Who had the access he needed? The deeper he thought about it, the more he realized that trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. This person, whoever they were, had to be cunning, ruthless. They had to be someone who knew how to play the game better than anyone else. He thought of Isabel. She had been a part of it all, the syndicate, the corruption, the lies. But she was gone now, tangled up in her own web of deceit. Richard had to be stopped, but Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that she had known more than she had let on. She was the key, or at least part of it. He needed a lead, and for that he needed to talk to someone who still had their fingers in the right circles. 2 hours later, Ethan sat across from Sophia Klein in a dimly lit backstreet bar. Sophia was a former associate of Isabel's, someone who had walked in the same circles, but had gotten out. She was smart, and she had always been more cautious than the rest of them. She knew things, and if there was any chance of finding the rogue player inside the syndicate, she would be the one to help him. Sophia eyed him across the table, her fingers absently stirring a glass of whiskey. She hadn't changed much since the last time they met Still sharp, still guarded, her eyes calculating, always 2 steps ahead. "Marco sent you, didn't he?" she asked, her voice low but not unkind. Ethan nodded, not bothering with small talk. "I need information. About the syndicate. About someone inside, someone who's trying to take them down." Sophia's eyes narrowed. "You're treading dangerous ground, Ethan. You have no idea what you're asking for. If you think Richard is the worst of it, you're wrong. The board controls everything, and they'll burn you alive if they think you're a threat." "I'm not afraid of them," Ethan said, his voice steady. "I just need to know who I'm looking for. Who's working against them from the inside?" Sophia studied him for a long moment, as if weighing whether to help him or walk away. Finally, she leaned back, her lips curling into a faint smile. "You've always been stubborn," she said. "Fine. I'll give you what you want, but I want something in return." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "What do you want?" She held his gaze, unblinking. "I want you to get me out of this city. The syndicate's been on my tail ever since I left, and they won't stop until they find me. Help me disappear, and I'll give you everything you need. But if you think you can just use me and walk away, you're dead wrong. You'll never get out. Not once they know you're involved." Ethan felt the weight of her words settle over him. He had never been one to deal in favors, especially not in a world where favors often came at a high cost. But this wasn't about him anymore. This was bigger than anything he had ever imagined. And Sophia was his only lead. "Deal," he said, his voice resolute. "I'll help you disappear, but you better have what I need." Sophia nodded, her expression serious. "There's a name. A ghost, really. Someone who was once part of the board. A woman. Her name is Lena Voss. She's been hiding for years, feeding information to anyone who'll listen. She's the one who's trying to bring them down from the inside. But no one's been able to find her. She's good at staying off the radar." Ethan leaned forward, his pulse quickening. "Where do I find her?" Sophia took a long drink, her eyes never leaving his. "That's the problem. She's always moving. But I can give you a starting point. A safe house she used to frequent. A place in the industrial district. It's been abandoned for years, but if she's still active, that's where she'll be." Ethan stood, the weight of his next move pressing down on him. "Thanks. For everything." Sophia's eyes softened, just for a moment, before the mask came back on. "Just remember, Ethan, there's no turning back from this. Once you go down this road, you're part of the game, and the board doesn't let players like you leave." The industrial district was a sprawling labyrinth of rusted metal, broken glass, and forgotten structures. The night was thick with fog, the air heavy with the smell of oil and decay.